Hello, welcome. I'm Kathleen Cavell, part of the leadership team at PDM, Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts. We celebrated our 20th anniversary. That's why there's a little birthday hat on our donkey up top. Last year, in 2023, at our launch party in 2003, we had as our featured speakers Robert Reich, Jim McGovern, and Marshall Gans. And we are a grassroots volunteer organization committed to making progressive legislation in Massachusetts and progressive candidates win in Massachusetts. And so far we've had modest success. These forums have been a wonderful addition to what we do. We have monthly forums started in January of 2021 on issues of public policy, issues of progressive concern, perhaps, is one way to say it. We've had candidate forums, and we do that regularly as well. This one is an educational forum about the Governor's Council because, as you may know, it's the least marked on Massachusetts ballots of any office that appears there, because most people don't know enough or anything about who their counselor is or what the council does. And its role is so vital. It's a constitutional office in the Massachusetts Constitution. Its role is so vital, and yet it is so obscure. So that's why we're doing this. We have, there are a lot of races this year, and those will not be the subject of this forum. What we want to do is just give people a sense who will share this also with other voters and their friends of why it matters, because we think it matters enormously. Our moderator today, I want to add one more thing. The chat is only for questions and links to valuable information, other sites perhaps, but it's not for comments, it's not for conversation. So please respect that. That works best at all the forums we've done. And again, please stay muted. We will record and post this forum afterwards. And it will also be on YouTube. And we ask that you tell people about it if you like it. And that's all you're going to hear from me. So with that said, I introduce our moderator, Harry Margolis, who will introduce our panelists, Jean Traunstein, Michael Albano, and John Griffin. Thank you. Please go, Harry.
Thank you, Kathleen. Morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be joined today by Michael Albano, Jean Traunstein, and John Griffin. Michael is a former mayor of Springfield, as well as a former member of the Governor's Council and the Parole Board, and he'll be speaking about his experience on both boards. Jean is a longtime activist and journalist, as well as a member of a grassroots group called Who Governs the Governor's Council, which is working to spread the word about the Governor's Council and create some more transparency about this. I'm also a member of that group, and this is, I thank PDM for including us in this forum to help us fulfill our goal of spreading the word. And then our final panelist is John Griffin, who is the managing partner for strategy at Partners in Democracy. And he'll be talking about kind of the undemocratic nature of the Governor's Council in many ways and how it might be made more small d democratic. Before they speak, I'm going to just say a few words about what the Governor's Council is. Then I'll give them each a chance to speak. And then I have a number of questions for them, and we will ultimately entertain questions that you may have. If you do have questions, post them in the chat. Kathleen will be curating them. And as she said, we want to keep the chat for questions and for valuable links, and not for any politicking or exchange of views. So what's the Governor's Council? As Kathleen said, it's little known. It's a survival from colonial times. In colonial times, there was an executive committee of the colony that basically ran things. Its power has been whittled away over time, but it's still very important. It's best known for vetting and providing advice and consent to nominations by the governor for judgeships in the state. But it's also important, it has a lot of other not less well-known roles. One of the most important is it also confirms parole board members, clerk magistrates who run the courthouses around the state. It also has a role with respect to the appellate tax board, the industrial accident board, notaries, justices of the peace, and then it's something to do with tax warrants, which I don't understand, but maybe Mike will explain to us, since he actually served on the board. And the parole board, of course, is incredibly important in terms of granting parole and revocations. And related to that, the Governor's Council also votes on commutations and clemency, something that until Governor Healy was elected, I don't think they had much of a role in, because the governor wasn't pardoning. The prior governors were not pardoning too many people. During the Baker administration, the governor nominated and renominated to the parole board a significant number of individuals without the experience you might want of in terms of social work, psychology, or substance abuse disorder experience. The nominations both to the parole board and to judgeships during the Baker administration were heavy on prosecutors. Apparently 60% of the 270 judges he nominated during his tenure were former prosecutors, or current or former prosecutors. As far as we know, in the almost 400 history of the Governor's Council, we believe there's only been one member who was a person of color. To relatively recently, they were all men. That's changed. Currently, all the members are Democrats. The last Republican member, I believe, left the council in 2019. So the Governor's Council, there are 8 Governor's Councilors for the state. Each district is made up of 5 state Senate districts, which as a candidate for Governor's Council myself a dozen years ago, I can tell you it's a big district and it's hard to cover. And it's hard, unlike someone running for state rep who might be able to knock on every door in their district, it's hard to get the word out, which I think relates to some of the questions about how democratic and transparent this can be when it's so difficult to reach the voters, for candidates to reach the voters. As a result, incumbents get reelected almost universally. The last incumbent who lost was in 2014. The longest serving member of the Governor's Council at the moment is Christopher Iannella from District 4, who was elected 32 years ago in 1992. Actually, prior to that, he had served, he's in District 4. Prior to that, he served 4 years in another district. So he has 36 years of experience on the Governor's Council. Currently, there's still a couple more weeks for candidates to get their nomination papers in, but currently, of the 8 districts, there are no challengers in 5 districts. There's 1 open district and 2 incumbents are being challenged. The primary is September 3rd. That also has something to do with low voter turnout and low voter knowledge, because this year's the day after Labor Day. It's always follows the summer when people probably have other things to have their minds on. As I said, I'm part of this group, Who Governs the Governor's Council. We have created a website at whogovernsthegc.org, where we have a lot more information about the Governor's Council, and we'll keep adding information about the election as it comes along, and about events like this. So we refer you to that. So I will now turn things over to our panelists, and starting with Michael Albano. I wonder if you could tell us something about your experiences on the Governor's Council and the Parole Board.
Well, Harry, thank you very much for that introduction and the work that you are doing with the Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts. I'm old enough to recall when Ed King was elected governor, a very conservative Democrat, if you will, although I think he was pretty much a Republican. But that was many years ago. And since the Progressive Democrats have come on the scene, we've had a lot more candidates that have progressive values. And I think that's very important to the future of this Commonwealth. I did run for the Governor's Council in 2012 and served for 2 terms. It was a great experience and a great honor to represent the citizens of Hamden, Hampshire, Berkshire, and Franklin County. And as you mentioned, I had 96 communities in my district. 96, it was bigger than the congressional district. So it's very difficult, obviously, to serve all of those communities and be active and be out there, but even more so to run a campaign and rely on television. It's very, very expensive. And it's virtually impossible to be an incumbent if they're doing their job. I ran as a progressive Democrat. In fact, I announced that I said, I am the progressive in this race. I had a 3-person race. And I ran and I said, I have a litmus test. And all the political folks said, you can't have a litmus test. We're picking judges. You know, you have to base it on their background and their qualities. I said, well, just watch me. I'm going to have a litmus test. And I'm going to make sure that the philosophy, because they're all qualified, I'm going to make sure that their philosophy reflects my values and the values I believe in the district, meaning a woman's right to choose, affirmative action, being sensitive to the LGBTQ community, and against the death penalty. And I ran on those issues, and I was successful by a small margin. By a small margin, only 1,000 votes, but I ended up winning. And I had a chance to serve with Governor Patrick and Governor Baker to make sure that these progressive values were fulfilled to the best of my ability. And I had a chance to confirm 5 Supreme Judicial Court nominees from Patrick and Baker. And they all conformed to these values that I had put in place, and they passed my litmus test. And I thought that was important. And let me just give you an example why I think it's important. Imagine for a moment, and I have no disrespect to my Republican friends and colleagues, so they just come from a different point of view and a different philosophy. But just imagine for a moment if Jeff Deal had become governor and Jim Lyons took over for Eileen Duff on the Governor's Council. Just imagine. And there was a shift, and Shauna O'Connell, the former state representative, very conservative, who's now the mayor of Taunton, if she had been elected to the Governor's Council, and they had to confirm Jeff Deal's nominees, we would have a massive shift, perhaps, from the left to the right in terms of our Supreme Judicial Court. And what does that mean? Well, you only have to look at our Supreme Court of the United States to see where we are. And it's a very conservative court, obviously. And I sometimes challenge the voters of Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania who couldn't stomach Hillary Clinton for whatever reason. And those 70,000 votes in those 3 states cost her the election. And now we have a very conservative Supreme Court. And I think it's going to be a long time before we get back to the values that I think we all want to see. But Harry, you mentioned that this was a little known agency, little known government entity. And that's true. And that's because, and I think the Boston Globe said the same thing, but that's on the Globe. The Globe should be covering these nominations every single minute in every single hearing. I've served on the school committee. I've served on city council as a mayor, governor's council. There's no more important position, in my view, than these judges that serve from the land court all the way to the Supreme Judicial Court. Why? Because they affect everybody's life every single day, one way or the other. So it's important that you have good nominees and good justices on all levels. But that's on the Globe for not making the coverage that they should be covered. And the only time they really cover things is when it's a Supreme Judicial Court nomination. So I'll leave that part there for the moment. I do want to say about the parole board, it's the most challenging position in government. I served under 3 governors, King, Dukakis, and Weld, conservative Democrat, liberal Democrat, and a moderate Republican. And I have to tell you, nobody in the world can predict human behavior. And trying to make a decision on who's ready for release is a very powerful situation, but it's very important to the community. But I'll leave you with this. We have a correctional system that's archaic, and it needs to be changed. And members of the parole board can make a difference if they lobby the governor and the commissioner of corrections, very important position, to make those changes. When I was on the parole board, I went to Walpole. We had a DDU unit at the time. People were in solitary confinement 23 and a half hours a day. Absurd to put people in cages and expect them to come out as normal functioning citizens. And then at the end of it, I had to go to the Shattuck Hospital to do parole hearings for people who were dying. And if you ever went to the Shattuck Hospital to do a hearing, you could see death, you could feel death. These were people that were on their last days, and we have to do better in our community of Massachusetts to be more compassionate relative to getting these people out and back to their homes before they pass on. So those are my 2 experiences. I'll leave it at that and look forward to the questions from the community.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Mike. Your last comment made me think of something. I was talking to one of my clients yesterday, whose son is at Bridgewater State at the moment. She pointed out it's one of Massachusetts is the one of the only 2 states in the country apparently that has a mental health facility run by the Department of Prisons rather than the Department of Mental Health. So,
well, it's sad. If you've ever been to Bridgewater, it's not a good situation, and to think people are getting the treatment that they need and deserve, it really hasn't happened. I prevailed. I tried to get Governor Patrick to move on this, in particular, to change the system there and to put it under the control of the Department of Mental Health, but without success.
okay, so our next guest or speaker is Jean Traunstein, who, as I said, is a writer, an activist about the Governor's Council, has been to many meetings, maybe more meetings than anyone else who's not a counselor themselves. And she'll talk about her observations and the rules that they do or do not operate under. The floor is yours, Jean.
Thank you, Harry. Well, first of all, it's really wonderful to see so many people here. This is such an important issue. And I want to say, I'm a writer and I write about the Governor's Council, and I've written actually about the Parole Board. And Mike, that's another subject for another forum, which we should have at some point. But in terms of the Governor's Council, I just want to say, what is it that got me interested in this, writing about this? And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the problems and their behavior issues as I see it. It got me, I was working at the time and I do work with this organization that is involved with Parole, Coalition for Effective Public Safety. And I went as a member of that organization to testify for my first time before the Governor's Council. I, at the time, was a full-time professor for Middlesex Community College, where I teach part-time. And I was told to identify myself as a professor and that I was not really going to talk negatively about the person who was up for a parole board position. And I'm not going to mention that person's name, but I want to talk about how we needed more substance use, counseling, all sorts of people on the board that were not from law enforcement, because the board was so heavily stacked with law enforcement at the time. So I remember I had my little speech in front of me, and I got there's a round table, and the Governor's Council meets only on Wednesdays, and they interview people on Wednesdays, and they have a meeting where they vote later in the day with the attorney, the governor's, I can't remember her name now, Harry, help me out there. The
Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, brain freeze. Okay, so I got up to speak, and one person on the council stopped me and said, "Do you know this candidate?" And I said, "Well, not personally." And then this person said, "Well, why on earth are you saying anything in front of this? What gives you the right to do that?" Now, I'm a pretty tough cookie in many ways, but it was a little shocking. It was intimidating. And it got me to see what on earth is going on if somebody can do this. Now, Mike has mentioned that the governor's council is not open to public meeting. They don't have to follow public meeting orders, which means that they can talk to each other in private. They can do a lot of things that other organizations can't do. And at the time, they didn't record the meetings. So it was a very, very private, it felt like a little club existing in the governor's office. And I was absolutely appalled. So I started going to meetings. And I want to share with you, in the time I have here, some of the problems that I've seen beside basic rudeness to people who come to testify, which is one, and a sort of know-it-all attitude as if they really, I've heard counselors say things like, "Oh my God, do you realize how dangerous it is to be on the parole board? Do you realize how dangerous it is?" I mean, not to say there isn't some danger involved, but that is an over-the-top statement that could really that could get somebody from not wanting to be on the board. So some of the things that are problems. One is, let's start with the fact that the board does not have a person of color and has not had a person of color since almost the beginning. Well, they've had people who they've appointed for positions, but they often are, I don't want to say exactly racist, but in some sense, the questions, comments seem particularly offensive to me. I was at a meeting when one counselor, fawned over a formerly incarcerated person who was a person of color, and it really was embarrassing to me. It seemed as if that was because the person was of color. And some of the statements they make, when Lucy Soto Abbey, a member of the parole board, was kicked off of the parole board, one of the counselors made a statement as if she personally was offended by that in terms of her voting record. And it was very clear that she had voted against people of color as well as voting for. There's some ethical issues of the voting. Should they be voting on when one of their members decides to become a clerk magistrate? Is it okay that the council votes on that position? I find that I tried to investigate with the Ethics Commission, couldn't get very far with that. I do have some qualms about that. Jubenville's daughter, Sarah Jubenville, became a judge. He didn't vote on it, but I just wonder, is there obviously some collegial thing? I mean, Marilyn Devaney, who we all know sometimes has incredibly problematic votes, she actually objected to that, and I have to give her credit for that. But there are some ethical issues. Some of the bad behavior has to do with the lack of rules. The lack of rules include things like they use their cell phones during the hearing whenever they want. You, when you're watching this on a screen, can't see that because the camera only focuses on the speaker. You don't see over on the side unless you're there, so-and-so picking up their phone. I take a lot of pictures of this because I think it's problematic. They leave often during the hearings whenever they want. They get there late. There are no rules about that. One person who is also a member of the governor's council, Laura Berland, and I had to go to the state office at the governor's council, at the state house for the governor's council to find out what the votes were during Charlie Baker's term, because none of the votes were digital. All of the votes had been recorded by hand. We had to go, for example, in a judge's file to find out what the votes were for that judge. And it took us quite a few hours. And then my editor at Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism got interns to come down so I could write articles using those votes, and we found the rest of them. That took hours. I do think they've changed that system, but it was because of they've changed the system in 2024. It took a lot of complaining. The final thing I'll say is there's arbitrary rulemaking that goes on, arbitrary rulemaking by the chair. And that is problematic. You get there, the chair says you have 2 minutes. There's nothing about how many minutes people have to speak. So I'm happy to entertain more comments and questions about this, but the governor's council needs an overhaul. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. So that's how it operates. And I wanted our next speaker, John, will talk about how people get elected and the democratic or non-democratic nature of that process.
Excellent.
Floor is yours, John.
Thank you, Harry, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to touch a little bit on that call to action from Jean at the end there, that there really is a need for an overhaul for the Governor's Council. My name is John. I am at an organization called Partners in Democracy, and what our mission is to promote what we call democracy renovation in Massachusetts. I'm also the new owner of a democracy renovation Substack newsletter that I can share and that I started more or less for the purposes of this forum as I was thinking through my comments. But what I mean by democracy renovation, what does that mean? It's redesigning our public institutions so that they're more effective and they're more responsive to public participation, and also giving people the tools and the knowledge that they need to participate effectively. And if you can think about any public body in Massachusetts that's really in need of some renovation, the overhaul that Jean was just talking about, I would say it would be the Governor's Council. We've heard some of the stories about exactly how its need for renovation is played out in everyday dysfunction, in lack of public awareness, lack of press attention, just lack of basic decorum. But I do want to suggest that the way that the council is elected plays an important role in all of those problems. And if we wanted to think about a better way for the Governor's Council to function and to play a role in our democracy writ large, we would want to think about how it's elected. To zoom out a little bit, something that I like to say pretty often is that Massachusetts has the least competitive elections for state level offices of every state in the entire country. So we hear a lot about how healthy democracy is in other places in the country. We hear a lot about voter suppression, which is very real in other places. But right here in Massachusetts, we have the lowest competition, the fewest people running for office, the fewest people that actually go to vote and have a choice on their ballot of any state in the entire country. And the Governor's Council is not only part of that problem, but maybe the signal case of that problem. It has some of the lowest levels of contestation, as we've talked about earlier. And in most council races, there's no competition in the primary or the general election or both. As is the case throughout the government in Massachusetts, throughout elected government, there's also more competition where it exists in the primary than in the general. You're more likely to have somebody running in a competitive election in the Democratic primary usually than in the general election, which is a problem if you consider that the turnout is actually much lower in the primary, of course, than in the general. So even when people run and contest, even when you have a choice on the ballot, the number of people that actually have access to that choice is much, much lower than it could be. All of those issues, though, are common to elected offices across Massachusetts. Competition is low for the state Senate, for the state House, generally across the board. But one thing that is specific to the Governor's Council is that beyond just the low level of competition, there's also many, many people, even when they do vote, that leave the Governor's Council blank on the ballot. And that's probably because many people, even high frequency voters, have no idea who their counselor is or what the council even does. If you go on the ballot, for instance, the ballot actually doesn't even say governor's counselor. It just says counselor. And as some people will talk about, there's a bill right now to add that one small word to the ballot, which might help some people know more what they're actually voting on. But in general, most people don't know who their counselor is or what they're voting for when they vote for it. And so they leave it blank more than any other race on the ballot for the state. Part of that too is probably just how big the governor's council districts are. So there are 5 Senate districts to each state Senate districts to each governor's council district. That means that each counselor has more people in their district than a congressperson would. And for people that are actually just going to vote, they're much more likely to know who their congressperson is than who their governor's counselor is. So what you have is low turnout elections, low levels of public awareness, and a civic press that doesn't really help matters. You don't really cover the things that the governor's council does. There's some coverage of the problems and some coverage of the controversies that you've seen, but even that, not very much. So people just don't know what they're voting for. And this is a body that has a huge amount of importance to many people's lives, as the mayor and councilor has said. We're talking about who gets to be a judge in Massachusetts. We're talking about who gets parole. We're talking about real people's lives and decisions whose effects the people that actually get approved can affect. It's a matter of decades of freedom or not for many people. So those are all the problems in how they're elected. And what I want to talk about is the question of whether it could be possible to have a governor's council that's chosen in a more democratic way, a way where more people who are voting or who are choosing the governor's council actually know what it does and have a sense of the importance of that choice. And to answer that question, I think that we first have to talk about what are the virtues that we would want in a governor's counselor, which are virtues that I think the counselor on the call certainly demonstrated in his time in office. But I think that are virtues mostly that are not served by the electoral system that points us to the governor's council. So what are things that we might want in the governor's council? We might want expertise in the judicial matters that are going before it. You might want people who actually know about what it means to be a good judge, what it means to decide whether or not to grant parole in a certain case. Those are all matters of judicial expertise. Of course, there are other points in the process where expertise comes in. We have the Parole Board, we have the Judicial Nominating Commission, but you might want expertise also in the Governor's Council. You also might want independence, political independence, from the person who the Governor Council has a check or a balance on. In that case, it's the governor for the most part. And then the third thing that you might want is just public voice. You might want a governor's counselor to just be the voice of the public in the room for what is otherwise a process that is pretty specific and policy centered. All of those 3 things are virtues that are not served by low turnout elections that are mostly chosen in very low turnout Democratic primaries with very low levels of public say. So how could you get more public say and actually serve those virtues? How could you get the governor's counselor chosen in a way that supports rather than undermines them? I think that the easiest answer, just in terms of the lawmaking of it, in terms of the actual strategy, is to improve the salience of the governor's council. Just make it so that more people know the importance of this. That's a question mostly for the press. We heard a little bit earlier about the Boston Globe's coverage. There could be more. And that's certainly the fastest and easiest way to get more public knowledge of the governor's council. But something that I want to suggest, which is actually related to the comment in the chat from Mark, is that we could think a little bit bigger in a democracy renovation mindset. If we really want to think about how would we redesign this public body to fill its function in the democratic system that we want it to have. And what I would say is, do we even need the governor's council to be elected at all? That's, of course, it's set out in the Constitution, so that's not an easy thing to change. This isn't a huge call to action. So much as to say, if you were to just select a number of random Massachusetts citizens from a hat to be the public voice, would you have a much worse situation than the governor's council as it currently exists? Or if you just selected a random selection of lawyers, even if you want the expertise. There are some things that you would lose, certainly. You would lose the political knowledge and the political expertise of people whose career is in public service. But there are some things that you would gain. You wouldn't be going through these elections. You wouldn't have low turnout. You would just have the voice of the public. I think democracy renovation, to my mind, is about going back to the very first piece of the consideration of any public office and saying, how would you redesign this to fill a function that actually makes democracy work better for people? And the governor's council, I think, is a perfect opportunity to ask that question because the public awareness is so low and the amount of controversy is so high. So certainly the first step is we just need more coverage and we need more attention to the successes that happened under Councilor Albano's term and the problems that exist now. But we could go a little bit further and just ask, does this need to be elected at all? And is it actually more democratic to have it act like a jury?
Good. Thank you very much, John. These were all great presentations, and I can start with a few questions I have. And the first, which may relate to somewhat a number of you talked about, is why are there so few people running for governor's council? And I guess any of you, if you have an idea of why that is, feel free to respond.
Well, Harry, just from experience, I can tell you, and I mentioned it in my introductory comments, it's just massive amount of 96 communities in my district and bigger than a congressional district. You know, Congressman Neal had a race a few years ago against Alex Morris, the former mayor of Holyoke. He spent $6 million. Morris spent $2.3 million. And I got 40% of the vote. Neal got 60%. To get out to this market, which is a relatively cheap media market, is still going to cost someone to run for governor's council $150,000 minimum to get attention. That's not counting print media or social media or whatever. So it can be very, very expensive to run, and it's challenging. It's challenging. So that's one of the reasons why so few people run, because it's costly, and they just don't have the resources. And trying to go out and raise money. I mean, I raised money as a mayor. It was a lot easier to raise money as a mayor than it was as a governor's counselor, because as John indicated, Gene indicated, nobody knows about it. And that's on the press. And one of the things I tried to do and did is I had regional hearings on my nominees that came from Western Massachusetts. Now, some of the counselors came, but most of them didn't. But at least we had a chance to present to the public who the nominees were, what positions they were going for, the impact they'd have on the community. Sometimes the press picked up on it. Most of the time they didn't. That's unfortunate. But these are the types of things I think would be important to gain some credibility to the council, and also to inform the public about what's going on the selection of judges, parole board members, industrial accident board.
That sounds like actually an excellent idea to respond to a lot of what both John and Gene have been talking about in terms of getting the word out and getting some daylight, sunshine on how the meetings run.
Well, I thought it was informative, and it gave people from Western Massachusetts who can't travel 2.5 hours to Boston on a Wednesday afternoon to sit in on a hearing, an opportunity to make their presentations. So they would come and they would comment. I'd write a full report up for my colleagues on the council and present it, and it was very helpful. It was the first time in the history of the Commonwealth that it was done on a regional basis that way.
Interesting.
Excuse me, Harry.
Sure.
I just wanted to say one thing related to something in the chat, which is the deadline is May 28th. So we don't know which counselors currently have no competition yet. That was asked by Lanny, and I just wanted to clear that up. So May 28th is the deadline. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Well, the next question I was going to ask was actually back to Mike. And Mike, you talked about the criteria or litmus tests you had for candidates for governor. wondering if the other councilors you served with appear to have their own criteria or litmus tests.
Well, some of them did, and my Republican colleague Jen Casey from Worcester, she was a big gun proponent, gun advocate, and the Second Amendment was very strong for her. Now, I disagree with her on that. She felt that everyone had a right to bear arms. Of course, I disagree with that, but that was her position, and I respected it, and that was part of it. On the issue of life, pro-life, a woman's right to choose, there was some disagreement on that with certain counselors. But I think it's an important issue, and it's one that I focused on all the nominees to the Supreme Judicial Court, and they all answered affirmatively. So, yeah, so some counselors have different positions, whether they advocate for those or not. Some of my folks out here say, you're crazy to have a litmus test. Whoever thought of that? But I thought it was critical. I thought it was important to show a difference between my opponents and where on the issue. So at least people knew what they were getting when they voted for me. If they didn't like it, they could vote against me. And, certainly 41% of the people voted against me. But be that as it may, I thought it was important. And I think every candidate for office for the Governor's Council who selects judges should have their positions known on these critical issues, because as I indicated, it can make a difference under the certain circumstances of our democracy.
Well, excuse me, but one of the problems, I think it's fine to have positions. One of the problems, I don't know if, if you noticed this as much as I did, Mike, but there is an enormous amount of grandstanding by the Governor's Council counselors on certain positions, and they will spend time on that rather than time on the candidates that come before them. That also needs some attention, so that it's because it's not about the governor's counselors' positions. It's about what is going on with the candidates and how do we find out if they would be the suitable people for office.
Well, that's a good point, Gene, but I think if you look at Congress or the Senate, you see the same type of posturing by congressmen and congresswomen all the time. They spend more time on their re-elections and fundraising than they do on the issue before them or the candidate before them. It's just unfortunate. It's part of our system today.
Yeah, I think that on this grandstanding issue, an interesting question is who the audience is for that. Because when you think about Congress, they do the grandstanding, they have their videos, it goes up to their base, they fundraise for it. But we know that there's not a lot of public attention to the Governor's Council, and when they go and they grandstand, there's certainly not positive coverage of that in any news articles. It's not like people get email blasts saying X counselor said XYZ. So who are they trying to reach when they grandstand, and why would someone be doing that as opposed to doing just their general public service? I think that, again, that question is related to this idea of the way that this whole system works right now. Who is it serving, and who do counselors view as the people that they're actually talking to when they just talk in their meetings?
Great. So there's some good questions coming in the chat, so I think we should turn to those. And the first, I might be able to answer. How does the Commonwealth determine which towns are in which districts? For example, this person's town in Dedham recently moved from District 2 to District 4. And as I said earlier, each Governor's Council district is made up of 5 state Senate districts. So what probably happened is that a state Senate district got redistricted as a result of the 2020 census, and then automatically the Dedham got moved from one district to another because of the state Senate change, would be my guess. Next question is, what is the time burden of someone serving on the council? How many meetings are there? How much other work is involved? And then also, what do the counselors get paid? And do they get any other benefits besides pay, such as a pension? And Mike might be able to talk about the time commitment.
Well, I think the time commitment can be whatever you make it out to be. I held office hours in my office in East Longmeadow every single Monday from 9 to 5. I did the public hearings. I also did, as a former mayor, I also took advantage of being close to the governor to lobby for my city and for the communities out here in Western Massachusetts on economic development bills and civil rights bills and all sorts of things before the legislature. So, you know, you can make it whatever it is that you want it to be. I interviewed every single candidate that came up for nomination, sometimes by phone, sometimes by Zoom, sometimes in person, whatever. But, you know, you're generally talking 20, 25 hours a week. The pay is $30,000, I think, unless it's gone to 35,000, whatever, something on that. You're in Boston 1 or 2 days a week. Generally, the council votes on Wednesday at noontime, but we have hearings that sometimes start at 10 o'clock, sometimes at 2 o'clock. So, you know, for a guy from Western Massachusetts, it's a considerable ride in, considerable ride back, and you're there for 6 or 8 hours. So I'd often stay at the Parker House and get ready for the hearings, you know, the night before. So it depends what you want it to be. And in my case, it was 20, 25 hours a week. It's considered a part-time job. And, you know, Howie Carr and the Herald will also always criticize the counselors. But if you're doing your job right, it takes a good amount of time per week.
The counselors make $36,000 a year, and at this point, and most of the current counselors have other jobs. Some are lawyers, some are not. They have to be there on Wednesdays. The rest of the time, as Mike was saying, is somewhat discretionary. I mean, they interview the candidates, often by phone, sometimes in person, and they are responsible for knowing the material that the candidates give to them. I think that some of the counselors, in my experience, put in a lot of work, and some of the counselors, it does not seem put in much work, and it varies enormously.
Okay. So related to what you were just saying, Jean, about a lot of the counselors doing this part-time and having other jobs, one question is when if the counselors are lawyers, especially if they're litigators, is there a conflict of interest if they are proving judges they might appear in front of?
Apparently not legally. Mike, I have a hard time with that. Personally, I'm wondering if you found that somewhat sometimes on the edge, or where you stood.
Well, one of the good things about Michael Albano is I'm not a lawyer, so I didn't appear before the judges that I confirmed. But, you know, some people have made an issue out of that. Some of the judges have recused themselves from making judgments on counselors who appear as attorneys on individual cases. So, you know, I think you have to have some trust in the system. And if a judge has a problem with a counselor having voted to confirm or not confirm, you know, the judge has the option of recusing themselves from that. And I think that is probably done more commonly than you might think. But certainly it's an issue for fodder, political fodder, and I think some people have run on that single issue that it appears at least to be a conflict of interest. The legislation was amended during Tom Merrigan time on the governor's council. He's an attorney, and he couldn't practice before governmental agencies, and that was amended by the legislature. So it is not a conflict of interest. It is authorized by law, signed into law by the governor at the time, and that is the way it is today.
Good, thank you.
I wanted to just say one thing that I think it relates to this. The counselors are also beholden to their constituents. And in terms of time, I think part of what I don't always see, I mean, I will say that I did meet with my counselor once about an issue that I was really concerned about, but I don't see time necessarily being made for constituents as a priority by the counselors. And I imagine some do and some don't. Again, not part of the rules. There is no requirement of how much time you have to give to people who want to, you know, come to you and make requests and ask about candidates. certainly counselors will refer to, I got this many emails, I got this many calls, but how much time they spend with their constituents, that's very unclear.
Probably hard to track. So, John, question's probably for you, which is if the governor's council is so bad, why not just have a constitutional amendment to get rid of it?
So I think that's a real question. I think that, to my mind, there are 3 options for trying to make this better. And like I said, the easiest one is to try and just increase the extent to which there's press coverage and people actually know what is going on with the governor's council. Because as I think the base problem is low competition in which people don't vote because they don't know what's going on. You could solve that if you made the elections higher salience. I think that it would be more effective to change it structurally. Whether you do that by eliminating the council, I think the council plays an important function, or by changing the way that the members are chosen is like the second question. Either one of those would require a constitutional amendment. So I see there's in the chat a question about whether we should use sortition, which that means essentially that's the choosing people's names from a hat randomly. You use functions and formulas to make sure that that's done in a way that's representative, which I think is an interesting idea. That's an idea that I've been thinking about. And when I mentioned the Substack earlier, I'm going to have a post about that in about a week. You could do it in other ways. You could say that in other states, these functions are played just by other elected bodies that have more public salience and knowledge anyway. So state senates in many places perform the same function that the governor's council does here. I think the governor's council would be an especially fruitful way to see how sortition would work in a public body, because there is a big movement behind it nationally. So that's something that I'm sort of interested in. But in terms of actually fixing the problem, again, it's one of many ways, and the constitutional amendment does make it hard.
Just
How about,
that, if I could, and I appreciate Jen's expertise on all this, but as you know, the constitutional amendment is a mammoth undertaking, undertaking. But some years ago, I think it was 2011, the Senate President Stanley Rosenberg from Amherst had actually filed a bill to do away with the governor's council, and then I got elected. I'm kind of friendly with Rosenberg, so that went away. But at the end of the day, someone has got to confirm these nominations. Somebody. Now, you can have the Senate do it, the state Senate do it, 40-member Senate, but I've argued against it. And think about that. The legislation that goes on, the interaction between the Senate president and the majority leader and the speaker, just think about the potential. I'm not saying we got good, honest people, but just think of the potential for horse trading there, for legislation, for judgeships. I mean, the potential is there, and I think someone's got to do it. So you could have the Senate do it, but I think it's probably more problematic than having the governor's council do it. Look at the United States Senate when Mitch McConnell held up that nomination to the Supreme Court. In a lot of ways, it changed the dynamics of the court. The same thing could happen if you had the Senate. So I like an independent body. Can it be a better independent body, the governor's council? Absolutely. But I'm not sure a constitutional amendment will ever happen. I don't know who's got the time or the motivation or the money to do it. And I think going to the state Senate is probably not the best idea in this guy's opinion.
Yeah.
I agree with Mike on this point. I've done a lot of research on the governor's council. And by the way, if you want to read any of my articles, I have been writing about, even though the Globe hasn't, and it's on Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism. So I write a lot about the governor's council as well as about the parole board. But I want to say that there was a senator, I believe it was a senator, it could have been a rep, who tried to get the council, and it's on our website, the information on this, who governs the governor's council. When this happened, somebody tried to get rid of the governor's council and have that happen, have it go through the Senate. But I agree that is a totally unwieldy situation. And I think we need a better governor's council, a fairer governor's council, one that is more responsive to its constituents and more, more knowledgeable about what it's doing and less rude to each other and to people who come before it, that's what I think would make a difference.
Let me ask, we're running short on time, but let me ask one question that's related to all this, which is really, what about term limits or ranked choice voting, which are also would take constitutional amendments, I believe, but would apply to more offices. So could apply to Governor's Council and to other offices. Would that solve any of these issues?
The organization that I work for, Partners in Democracy, one of the reforms that we support is it's called the Top 5 election system, which they just passed it in Alaska. And the general idea of it uses nonpartisan ballots in the primary and then ranked choice voting in the general election. And the basic point of it is that whereas now for most elections, the most important part of the election is the primary, which is lower turnout. If you switch them using this model, the actual important election would be the general election where people are turning out. So ranked choice voting, I think, is good, and it would solve a lot of the problems with the specific electoral incentives that we see with the Governor's Council. With term limits, I think it gets back to the question of what you want the Governor's Council to be doing. And if you just want it to be sort of a public voice and a check on the political system, then sure, term limits might be good. But if you think that there's value to political expertise and to accumulating a base of knowledge, all that term limits is going to do is mean that the people that have that knowledge are outside actors like lobbyists, which, to my mind, I generally find that a little bit difficult to find a rationale for.
I'm
Mike?
gonna use my role at PDM to just remind you of one more thing, that there is an action item in the chat. Senate 406, House 665 are both legislation that would require on our ballots that it not just say counselor. I think nobody's mentioned that precisely, but that's one of the reasons that people leave the ballot blank. What kind of counselor are we talking about? It will use the word governors ahead of counselor. So if you are interested in something you could do with your state rep, your senator, your rep, you could ask them to sponsor those one or other of those bills, because that would actually change our ballots and make it clearer who people are or aren't checking off on their ballots. Thanks.
So clearly this conversation could keep going on for much longer. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. So I'd like to thank everybody for participating. I'd like to thank Kathleen for helping put this together and introducing us, and PDM for sponsoring this forum, Mike Albano for talking about his experiences, Jean for what she's observed, and John for how we can perhaps fix this problem that we face. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks.